Hey everyone, Brandon here from TruckSafe. The Federal Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse has now been in place for more than 3 years. Now, recent data from the FMCSA indicates that well over 120,000 CDL drivers are currently in prohibited status due to a drug or alcohol testing violation. Now, the whole point of the clearinghouse is to alert motor carriers to the fact that a driver they are currently or thinking of using is in prohibited status, so that they can take necessary action based on that information. But one big criticism of the clearinghouse over the last few years has been the way that it handles those types of notifications to employers. That in mind, the FMCSA recently announced a big change to the way that it handles those notifications, which is what we're discussing in this video. So stay tuned, do us a favor, hit that like and subscribe button below if you find this type of content helpful. As we discussed in a prior video, the Clearinghouse's 3-year anniversary in January of 2023 brought with it changes to the process that motor carriers must follow when first onboarding CDL drivers. But even more recently, in mid-March of 2023, the FMCSA overhauled the way that its clearinghouse notifies employers, motor carriers for example, of any changes to their driver's status after having run a required query. But before diving into those changes, it's important to first understand how the clearinghouse functions at a very basic level. First off, the clearinghouse is a central repository of drug and alcohol testing data for all CDL drivers operating in the United States. It functions through regulatory reporting and querying obligations, whereby information about a commercial driver's positive test result, refusal to test, or other violations gets reported to the clearinghouse and associated with that driver's CDL number. That information then appears in any queries run by subsequent employers of those drivers during the hiring process, by law enforcement during roadside inspections, and by state driver's licensing agencies when issuing or renewing the driver's CDL. For their part, motor carriers have an obligation to run 2 different types of clearinghouse queries on any CDL drivers they employ or engage, the first of which are called full or pre-employment queries. Now, these full queries reveal the nature of any prior drug or alcohol testing violations for a particular driver and whether the driver has completed the return to duty process. Employers are obligated to run full queries as part of the onboarding process for prospective CDL drivers, as well as in situations where a limited query, which we'll talk about in a second, on that driver reveals that information exists in the clearinghouse. Drivers and prospective drivers must grant the employer specific consent to run these full queries, and that consent must be given by the driver through his or her clearinghouse account. If a full query reveals that a driver has a prior drug or alcohol testing violation and has not completed that return to duty process, then the driver must not be used to perform any safety-sensitive functions, including driving. All right, the second type of clearinghouse queries are known as limited or annual queries. These reveal only if information about a particular CDL driver exists in the clearinghouse, not the substance of that information. Employers are obligated to run limited queries on all existing CDL drivers at least once every 12 months. Drivers must provide the employer their written consent to run these limited queries, but the consent for the limited queries can take the form of a general consent to run all limited queries throughout the course of that driver's employment. If a limited query reveals that information about a particular driver exists within the clearinghouse, the employer must then run a full query on that driver within 24 hours to see what that information is. If that full query is not run within that time frame, the driver has to be removed from safety-sensitive functions. Now, in terms of the recent change, it's important to know that prior to March of 2023, the clearinghouse did very little to automatically notify employers when the status of their drivers changed. For example, if a motor carrier ran a limited query on a driver on January 3rd that indicated the driver was good to go, in other words, not in prohibited status, but that driver subsequently was put into prohibited status the next day on January 4th, the clearinghouse would not alert the carrier to that change in status. This was a problem because it meant that carriers were potentially blind to the fact that some of their drivers may be in prohibited status, and unless and until either the driver specifically notified them of that fact or the carrier ran a subsequent query, which may not happen for another 12 months. The lone exception to this problem was with the full pre-employment queries, which even prior to the changes in March of this year, had a 30-day tail to them. This meant that if a driver's clearinghouse status changed within 30 days after an employer ran a full pre-employment query, that carrier would receive an automatic notification about that status change. But again, that only occurred if the status change occurred within the first 30 days after the initial pre-employment query. To address these gaps, the FMCSA recently overhauled the Clearinghouse notifications. Now, employers will receive automatic notifications anytime the driver's status changes within a full 12 months after the employers have run either a full or limited query. Importantly, these types of Clearinghouse notifications indicate only that a driver's status has changed. They do not indicate the nature of that change. For this reason, once a carrier receives a status change notification, it has to then run a follow-on full query to get the underlying details about that status change. According to FMCSA, such follow-on queries must be run within 24 hours after the carrier receives the status change notifications, or else the driver must be removed from safety-sensitive functions. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. FMCSA's revisions to the Clearinghouse's notification system are significant because they fill gaps that existed in the system and allowed prohibited drivers to slip through the cracks. For even more in-depth information about these types of regulatory topics, be sure to check out our innovative online compliance courses for safety managers and for drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. Also, be sure to check out our detailed compliance articles on our website at trucksafe.com and follow us on our various social media pages for the latest highway transportation news and analysis. Thanks for watching.